Hello there, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us. I'm Varun Sriram with UCAN and absolutely thrilled to be joined by Dr. Krista Austin, sports scientist, exercise physiologist. She's going to school us all about performance nutrition for marathons. Hey, Krista, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you, Varun?
Doing great. It's a pleasure to have you on. We've, had known you for a long time. I'm really happy to have you be able to bring your wealth of knowledge to our audience and talk about a subject that you've got a deep knowledge base about. Krista, I'll do a little bit of a bragging on your behalf, and then let you tell us a little bit more about your background. But you've kind of done it all. You've worked for the United States Olympic Committee, the cricket team in England, USA Taekwondo, USA Triathlon, USA Wrestling. You've done work with the armed forces, really all sorts of work in terms of helping people fuel themselves, train to get the best out of themselves. What drives your passion for the line of work that you're in?
I think it started just years ago with my internship at the United States Olympic Committee. I had good mentors and a phenomenal experience when I was very young working with elite athletes. And so I think it's your initial experience in the field that really determines the, projection you take with a career. And it just was so energetic and enthusiastic around the offices. And you were just always working to do whatever it took to bring home something nice and shiny. That was the motto in essence. And it was always about innovation, being the best we could possibly be. And so early on, I just had great mentors that instilled a lot of things in me that have carried on over the years.
Now, as you've moved on in your career and got kind of a diverse range of experience, you kind of crafted yourself as a sports scientist. What does that mean? When you work with athletes, or when you work with athletes of all levels, really, what are you focusing on with them?
So sports science has really become a term that is for someone who takes on a more broad approach, I would say, to examining someone's performance potential. And you're responsible for taking a look at all the different disciplines that may impact performance, whether that's medical health, nutrition, or biomechanics, or psychology, and helping to integrate it and say this is how it's playing a role for this individual. And what happens with someone of my background is that, years ago I got degrees in physiology, and physiology really is about all the systems of the body. And so I think naturally they've kind of morphed us into sports science and said these guys are sports scientists. But over the years, we've been referred to as sport physiologists as well. And so I think the terms are kind of interchangeable. It's just a function of the changing times and what people try to coin as sports science or sports physiology. I think they're one and the same. But over the years, they've just utilized physiologists for all the different disciplines because it's usually the underlying factor that connects them all.
In the time that you've been working with athletes and been in this industry, how have you seen the focus and perhaps the advances? I don't know if the advances is the right term, but when it comes to nutrition, have you seen over the years where there's more being understood and learned, or more importance being placed on nutrition versus when you first were doing your first internship with the USOC?
Yeah, I mean, today nutrition is about food availability and really honing in on the actual principles and properties of the food itself. Whereas back when I first started, I remember it was just about, okay, how many grams of carbohydrate, protein, and fat per kilogram of body weight. And we really didn't at that point in time dive in too much with regards to the foods themselves. Today, we will do that with an individual and help to understand what their body's responding to the best with regards to body composition and training, and whether or not they, want to be plant-based as an athlete, or if they, want to be on a more high carbohydrate diet consistently, or on a, more moderate carbohydrate diet. And what are those carbohydrates that are being put in versus just total carbohydrate intake? And it started back then just very simplistically, and then we moved into the area of nutrient timing, especially for elite athletes. That was important because it really seemed to influence how well they could recover and create changes in body composition, and that kind of was the next big thing. And then, we start looking these days at what are the specific innovations in macronutrients, micronutrients, nutritional supplements that can actually help take us to another level. And that's something that I think, Generation UCAN Super Starch actually did for us back in 2008, 2009, when we started getting introduced to it, that it was just that unique of a carbohydrate that could be incorporated into an athlete's nutrition plan. So items like that have come to the forefront of sports nutrition, and I think that's where you start to see some of the more innovative changes that we have today. They're more minute in nature. They're not very global like nutrient timing is, but they're very specific and defined. And I think that's what's going to continue to drive changes in the sport nutrition industry, as well as just the fact that today we sit back and we say, okay, it's not just about performance, it's also about what's better for you, what's better for their health, because we're becoming more and more cognizant that this population isn't always healthy. And so we've got to do both for them, performance and health.
So a lot of what you just described, Krista, might really have answered this next question I was going to ask you, but I'll ask it anyways. How would you describe your approach? What is your approach as a sports scientist or sports physiologist to working with an athlete?
So typically when athletes come to me today, it's that they've got something going on. Either it's a medical issue, or they're trying to sustain their performance somehow, or they need some type of performance enhancement. They've just hit a plateau. They don't know why they've hit the plateau, and they're looking for that next springboard for their performance. And that's whether it's an elite athlete or a recreational athlete, and they say, can you help me with one of these factors? Usually when they come in, I sit down and I try to actually tie them together, because typically they are very interwoven, that if the athlete doesn't have their health, they're not going to be able to sustain their performance. And if their performance isn't sustainable, then we're not going to be able to actually enhance performance, because that takes very consistent training. So they usually come in with a list of here's what I need to achieve, or here are what my issues are, and we try to place them into those categories and periodize an approach to helping them achieve their goals.
When it comes to elite marathoners, you've worked with the best of the best in that the U.S. has had. Meb Keflezighi, Dathan Ritzenhein, 7 Olympic appearances between the two of them. Goucher, multi-time Olympian. With the elite marathoners, how did that start? How did you start? I think, was Meb the first one you worked with? And if so, how did you start working with elite marathoners? And what do you think you bring to somebody training for a marathon?
So I think, back in the day in 1999, I had started as an intern at the USOC, and Meb was there as a young elite athlete, and actually met him when they were, working with them on the recovery principles with an ice bath. And at that point in time, U.S. distance running was trying to kind of reemerge. And Coach Joe Vigil and Coach Bob Larson had linked up with the USOC to try and build Meb and Dina Castor as part of the next step in that process. They believed that they had good potential in the 10K, but also the marathon eventually. And so after the 2000 Olympic Games, Coach Vigil recommended that we start taking the emphasis on the marathon for 2004. And that was when I really started kind of getting tutored. It was like tutoring on distance running, and specifically the marathon itself. And then it just continued to grow from that point forward because of the immense knowledge that they were providing. I kind of became like a storage depot for it. And so as athletes would go and search, Meb or someone else would actually just say, hey, why don't you give Krista Austin a call and see what she might think? And so that's what it's become over the years, is I'll end up engaging with our elite marathon runners because of the knowledge that I've gained through those processes. And, obviously what they did in 2004 worked really well. Both Meb and Dina medaled, and they've just helped me grow over the years to provide me with all the knowledge, really, that we have today that I can pass on to no matter who it is, whether it's sitting down with a Des Linden or a Dathan Ritzenhein or a Kayak Goucher or a Amy Yoder-Bagley, and her, being a coach now and needing to pass that on to that next generation.
It's really amazing. I mean, the names you're mentioning really are a who's who of, marathoners that the U.S. has had to offer. So, like you said, I think being able to accumulate that knowledge and then pass it on, it's immensely valuable. And frankly, it's really a treat for everyone listening to this that we get that as well. So that's really cool. Now, you mentioned previously that, that you work with both the elite runners as well as your everyday runners, charity runners, recreational runners, however you want to term it. How different are the things that the elite runners want to know versus what the everyday runners want to know?
The topics aren't that different. I just think the differences that I see when they come to me is that the elites have really already drilled down. They're much more narrowly focused and know much more in detail what they're going to ask. They're going to ask you a tougher version of the question, but really they're asking about the same topics that the recreational runners are asking, whether that's tapering for the marathon, fueling for the marathon, or, when do I do speed training? How does speed training apply, to periodization? All kinds of things that they ask about, but really it's the same question. It's just the elites can be that much more poignant because of their knowledge of the marathon.
Well, and like I just previously said, I guess that's the beauty of having you on. You, if people don't know what to ask, then you're going to help us figure out the questions that we should be asking if we're training for a marathon. So I want to dive in a little bit to the into your nutrition philosophy around the marathon, both training as well as for people that are getting ready to race a marathon. And one of the things you said in the beginning, and when we were talking about why people come to you, is it's often when there's an issue, right? When something is going wrong, when something doesn't feel like it's optimal. From a marathon nutrition, marathon fueling standpoint, what are some of those key things where people come to you and say, I need your help, this isn't going the way it should be?
Well, from the racing standpoint of view, it's usually two key factors. One, they're trying to prevent GI distress during the marathon, or two, they're having issues such as bonking or cramping. It usually falls into those categories, and because of those two being so interlinked during the actual race itself, you end up talking about both of them. If they have GI issues, they're usually staying away from taking in too much carbohydrate, and so you've got to actually address the fact that they may be bonking or cramping in a race because they don't have enough carbohydrate. So how do you fuel that athlete to experience neither? And so that's one of the biggest things. And then the area on the training side is usually always related to body weight and composition. And how do I manage that effectively while still getting gains in performance and being able to recover and sleep? We know that in running, the more aerodynamic they are, the leaner they are, the lighter they are oftentimes, they're going to go faster as a result. So it's usually those are the questions that they come to the table with.
So that's really interesting. Let's attack both of those separately and dive in a little bit deeper. So you started talking about the issue of having the GI issue, and then the link between that and bonking. So typically that's something that an athlete, elite or recreational, is going to experience in a race. So it's something that probably after they experience that for their next go round when they're training, they want to correct it. How do you start going about that process and tackling that process with an athlete that's just experienced one of those two things, or perhaps both of those things in combination when they come to you?
So we go back to the race they were just in, and we break down, what they were using when they had issues during the race, and say, is this a pattern that's consistent with other races? And the answer is usually yes. And so I say, okay, well, here's your race plan. Let's take a look first and foremost at what time you wake up in the morning and how you're fueling your body to the start line. And typically what you see with most runners is that they don't eat enough on the way to the start line. They're nervous, they're anxious, and they're trying to keep the food down. And if they've had a bad experience, then they're more likely just to minimize what they're taking in. But here they're getting ready to start an event that's going to be very energy depleting. And so you say, okay, look, if you become energy deplete early on, you're going to hurt your race. So teaching them how to preload for the race with what we call low residue foods, foods that don't have a lot of fiber in them, is usually one of the first things we'll attack in their actual plan. And that's where a product like the Super Starch from Generation UCAN has become really effective. Dathan Ritzenhein talks about this frequently in terms of the preload, because the osmolality is so low that it easily digests and moves through the stomach, and it allows them at each hour to consistently be taking in 100 to 200 calories so that they can fuel their body up to the start line without too many issues. In addition to that, it's going to help them long term because they have enough carbohydrate just kind of seeping into the body because of how that carbohydrate works as they go throughout the marathon. So that's the other benefit. Now,
so
once
that
they're in the
really
race,
say that. Sorry, go ahead. What was that?
so I was going to say, now once they're in the race, what we typically say is how much do they actually need to get through it? Can they actually manage their energy levels appropriately? And that's where we, let them use what they want to use throughout the race, whatever works best for them. But we try to keep it there in doses that are actually small enough that we know they're not going to, experience the GI distress. And they can focus more on hydration and sodium content, things of that nature, and making sure they're getting that down. And usually that's part of the secret to our success when we're actually in a marathon, is that we can minimize how much we have to take in once we're actually in the race. But it's very dependent on the individual, and it's about training the gut to handle whatever you're going to do on the day. I can't tell you how many people don't train the gut appropriately. They wait too late, and then they have issues on the day of competition. So that's usually what we focus on to prevent both the GI and the actual bonking in race.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is, when we think about marathon fueling, I think so much of the conversation and so many of the products are designed around this idea of what you're taking during the race. But I think what's really fascinating that you were talking about was really this emphasis of fueling the right way before you even start, and I think you started it off by saying most runners come to the start line underfueled. So clearly, what has been the secret to your success is not necessarily something yet that is largely prevalent with a lot of runners, probably for a variety of reasons. They can't find the thing that sits well in their stomach before they run, or it's simply nerves. But one thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about in terms of what you were just talking about. So you talked about the super starch and utilizing that pre-race. You're able to, or pre, any type of long training, you're able to pack in the calories, and it's a slower release. What would happen if you tried to do something similar with a high glycemic carbohydrate source, a more sugary carbohydrate source? Like, is that something that runners have tried the same approach with, to pack in the calories that way? And in your eyes, is that a good or a bad approach?
Yeah, I mean, athletes have tried that in a variety of forms, whether it's in gels or rice. And you have one athlete used to take rice and mix in the jelly to make his concoction of, about 800 calories before he raced an Ironman, actually. But what would typically happen is that they kind of felt the rise in blood glucose and then that sharper fall. And at the end of the day, it just wasn't the right feel for them as they went to the line. They had to keep pumping in the higher glycemic carbohydrates to kind of keep that energy level they felt like they were getting from that pre-fuel session that they were doing. And so what we've done over the years is to try and find the right mix, where we preload with the UCAN, and that's really the base of our energy, and then mix in foods that they actually can kind of enjoy a little bit more. You know, they enjoy toast a bit better, or some toast with egg a little bit better in the morning rather than, you know, rice with jelly on it. So we've just taken some other approaches so we don't have the spike and crash effect, and also the potential GI issues that might come from the higher glycemic carbs.
And this is something I know that you've had a lot of experience with, Krista, as you've worked with athletes. And this is a question that, you know, for people that are actual UCAN users, we get this a lot. But if you have, you know, the superstarch with from the UCAN products as your base, kind of that slow, even release of carbohydrate that's lasting you a long time, is there, how should I ask this? Is there almost less of a worry of the crash if you're taking in a higher glycemic carbohydrate source? I mean, is that at least anecdotally what you've experienced with athletes, where utilizing UCAN as a base makes them less susceptible to swings if they're taking in something that's quicker in conjunction with it?
Yeah, it actually does make them less susceptible, and it does let them go ahead and eat the other items as well. So it's kind of interesting. It's something we've played with a lot, probably, you know, the majority on the Ironman side, to be honest with you. I work in triathlon a lot, but really what they've shown me over the years is the athletes kind of make their own concoctions, is that if the UCAN is the base, then they can mix in a lot more food on the whole and have some of those nice high glycemic carbohydrates that they like they'll put jelly on their toast, right? And they just don't feel the ups and downs. So it's helpful because overall we get more calories in the most enjoyable way for the athlete.
So that's really interesting, and a good insight into kind of your race fueling approach. And I think even just broadly speaking, that idea of starting out with low glycemic carbohydrate when you're going into an event, you know, it's probably not something that's broadly understood amongst runners. I think, you know, even when you were talking in the beginning about kind of the how the focus on nutrition has shifted, you know, over time, where people have more of an understanding of not just, you know, what the nutrient is, but kind of the different, how it differs based on the quality of the nutrient. I guess in your estimation, like, do you feel that there, when you're working with athletes, there is a broad understanding of, like, let me start with something slower and then perhaps move to something faster later on?
No, they don't really have that understanding. Most of them are actually surprised that there's even research out there looking at high glycemic versus low glycemic breakfast prior to running. And they're surprised to find that the lower glycemic meal actually seems to elicit the better response. And so part of what I think has tripped them up over the years is that they try to consume too much as actual food in the low glycemic, and so they get this kind of this heaviness sitting in their stomach when it's actual food. Whereas when we've been able to mix in the generation UCAN with, say, like some eggs and toast, that's like one of their favorites, or, you know, peanut butter on toast with some jelly, because we are not relying so much on a huge amount of food, and we're letting the body use something that can digest easily and be absorbed that much more easily without all the ups and downs, they just get that much better of a response. So then the athletes buy in and they go, oh, wow, gosh, you know, this is working really well. And then to find out too that you should actually mix it up and get some shifts in the type of carbohydrate, and that you're probably going to need high glycemic carbohydrates even more so on the back end of a marathon than you would at the start of a marathon, is something just very, very new to them. So one of the ways we'll work with an athlete is to say, let's start the marathon with something low glycemic, maybe the first hour, and then nibble on high glycemic carbs as we go through the rest of the marathon. It's really dependent on what their stomach can tolerate. And it's really allowed us to have a bit more versatility in what we're able to offer them with regard to creating sustainment of blood glucose, and then the increased fluctuations that they really need on the back end. You know, if you can take in that much more high glycemic carb on the back end because your stomach's not already saturated with it, they actually are feeling like they can perform that much better. So, you go into the Boston Marathon and you're coming up on the, fire station, and you're getting ready to take the hills, and you can kind of say, okay, let me give myself some extra high glycemic carbohydrates because it's not going to upset my stomach because I've been fueling with something else the majority of the race. It actually works really, really well. And it allows them to go through that back half of the marathon maybe just a little bit better because they are sustaining these higher fluctuations in blood glucose. So that's new to a lot of runners, but I think it's something that if they work with someone to build a plan out the right way, it actually is what's going to become the trend, I would say, in most sports, is to use a slow release carbohydrate and complement it with some high glycemic carbs when they really do need it.
It's really fascinating and really good insight, Krista, to have you kind of lay that out. I think what's been interesting for us is, people have utilized UCAN is trying to figure out, if I don't want to carry it with me and if I just want to use it before, is there still a benefit? And I think kind of, with what you've laid out, kind of with talking about even the research that's being done on low glycemic breakfast versus high glycemic breakfast, it's a really fascinating kind of topic, and glad you were able to expand on it more. Just, even from an athlete perspective, Sarah Sellers, a professional runner who was runner-up at the Boston Marathon last year, who has been fueling with UCAN in her training, kind of talks about a lot of the same things that you were just sharing, that the athletes you've worked with have experienced, where, it's tough if you want to kind of load up on low glycemic foods. You get that really heavy stomach feeling, if you want to get enough in. So she's really found kind of that secret sauce because, she's a nurse. She trains sometimes at like 4 or 5 in the morning. So for her to get up, 2 hours before that and eat a big meal, it's not realistic. So she's doing really similar to what you laid out, kind of having UCAN in combination with some eggs and some toast, and that's really able to fuel her for these long training workouts, especially ones that are at odd hours in the morning. So really fascinating. I wanted to move also now into talking about nutrition for training, and one of the things you outlined when you're talking about training nutrition was, your overall approach to nutrition was the body weight and the body composition. I was really surprised when I started, interacting with marathoners and getting into this about 8 or 9 years ago, how many people were struggling to lose weight while training for a marathon. And it felt counterintuitive to me. And then started learning more about the nutrition and what people were typically eating, and the blood sugar and insulin response started to make a little bit more sense. But how much of a issue and challenge do you see with people training for a marathon and trying to also manage their body weight and keep their body composition where they want it to be?
Yeah, so one thing people don't understand about marathon training is usually they're coming off a 5K, 10K block where they're doing a lot of high intensity work. And the high intensity work is interesting because it usually suppresses appetite, and it also asks our body to fully turn on our energy systems when we're doing it. Turn fat metabolism all the way on and carbohydrate metabolism all the way on to get me through this 5K or 10K workout. When they go into marathon training, they start running a lot more at a very slow pace. And in all reality, it's not burning as many calories. But when they stop, they say, my gosh, I've done, 20 miles, and they feel really hungry about half an hour later. And then they go and they start nibbling and eating and eating and eating. And they think because they've been out there for 3 hours that they're supposed to have all these carbs, especially high glycemic carbs. And that's actually not correct. Most people do not go out there and run for, more than 2.5, 3 hours at any one point in time, especially when they're recreational athletes. And in truth, you need to replace the calories, but you didn't do work that was so glycogen depleting that you shouldn't just rely on natural mixes of carbohydrate that is low glycemic and protein. And so oftentimes they'll complain that they're putting on weight and body fat as they train for a marathon. And so one of the things we've been able to do is to introduce the super starch from Generation UCAN as a means to actually help them refuel with a low glycemic carb that also tends to give them a response where they say, I'm not quite as hungry as I am if I just went without anything, or if I went and did something that was very high glycemic. And then we can get them to just slowly nibble back through towards lunch, dinner, what have you, and it seems to control their appetite just that much better. It also gives them carbohydrate, which is what they want to rely on with marathon training, and that is the trend. But it gives them a source that isn't going to spike their insulin consistently and increase the potential for fat stores or the development of body mass. So it's a great, approach to helping them control how many calories they take in, their overall appetite, and just making sure they don't eat too much when they do the marathon training.
Now, this is certainly a very powerful tool for, the everyday runner, especially people that are fitting training in around just life, working, family obligations, where, it can be very easy to kind of slip up and not have the time, to prepare a proper meal and kind of just grab something quick and convenient. So, this way that you're able to utilize the super starch and UCAN to kind of keep people in that very steady mode immediately after a run, I think is really powerful. But what's also interesting, Chris, I think, which I'd love to have you share more about, is, and this is again kind of bridging how there's a lot of similarities between, what everyday runners can benefit from and elite runners can benefit from. When you first helped introduce UCAN to Meb back, I believe, in 2009, and started implementing it for recovery for him, a lot of it was kind of with some of the same ideas in mind, right? Where Meb was getting a little bit later in his career, and perhaps some of the mileage was ramping down, so he was using nutrition more as a way to stay lean and satiated after his workouts. Did that at all come into the thought process when you were introducing the super starch to Meb, specifically after his runs?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing with Meb was that no matter what product we tried after his runs, he could feel the sugar aspects, and he would always talk about it. He didn't really care for it. And plus, I will tell you, he's always been very diligent about body weight control, body composition. And one thing he noticed, and he's just this disciplined to do this, was that as he got older, each mile became that much more efficient, and the total caloric burn was just that much less. So sometimes what an athlete will do is say, well, you know what, I'll just skip my post-workout nutrition, and I'll just wait until I get to lunch because I'm not burning as many calories these days anyway. Yet we know that athletes that do two-a-days actually need to begin refueling as soon as possible. The one thing the UCAN gave us was a product that sat well with Meb and allowed him, or he was willing to then refuel post-exercise because he didn't feel the ebbs and flows of the blood glucose. So that was a lot of our thinking, was that he always did want something, and we were looking for a product that would sit well with him. But yeah, as they get older, they get more efficient. They don't burn as many calories per mile, and so they have to be more conscientious if they're going to maintain body weight and composition like they need to at that elite level. And I'll tell you, that goes the same for the everyday runner. It doesn't really differ, to be quite frank with you. I utilize it pretty strategically with people to help them, reduce the amount of sugar they have in their nutrition plan, and to help them use the sugar that they should have in it in a manner that they want to. So one of the things I'll ask people is, okay, if I have, 50 grams of sugar for the day to spend with you, how do you want to spend them? And usually it's not in your post-recovery nutrition or in the nutrition you're taking in during training. They say, well, I'd rather save that and have it at a meal and have something like maybe some French fries. And it's much more preferable.
So in that sense, kind of some of what you were talking about, what the discussion we were getting into when we were talking about the race fueling with the low glycemic carbohydrate kind of early on, and that minimizing for a lot of runners what they might need to take in during. I mean, that really comes into play in the training when you can do that over and over and over again and reduce the amount of sugar you need to take in during those long runs, of over 8 weeks or 12 weeks. I'm sure that can really make a difference when we're talking about body composition.
Yeah, I mean, the lower the glycemic load of the nutrition plan, the more you should lean up, as long as your energy balance equation is appropriate. And so that's where low glycemic nutrition is more ideal for elite marathon runners, recreational marathon runners, and pretty much all of us, to be honest with you. I mean, keeping the glycemic load low is where we want everyone to be. If you look at Shalane Flanagan's books, she calls them run fast, eat slow. And what she's, providing everyone with is low glycemic nutrition, which is where we all should be.
So what from a food standpoint, we've talked a little bit about achieving it with superstarch, and that's really from a digestion standpoint, it's really ideal to be for athletes who respond well to it and who like it. From a food standpoint, how do you kind of achieve that low glycemic fueling for training or for racing, outside of utilizing superstarch?
Yeah, so, there's a couple reasons why you might actually, need to do that, even with regards to just the person who cannot consume a corn product. I do have those clients as well who are allergic to corn. And so what we do with them is really work to manipulate their protein source and their carbohydrate source prior to a race to make it as low glycemic as possible and as low residue as possible. Now, they can't always get the same level of calories in for the race that you could if you were able to use the UCAN. And then once they're in the race, we actually just use a non-corn based high glycemic carbohydrate in very small amounts just to fuel them throughout. So that works well. But then on a day-to-day basis, people that I work with, I mean, we are chronically sticking with a low glycemic nutrition plan. So our plates are usually based on protein, healthy fats, and then low glycemic carbs, whether it's putting a large salad that's really good with it and some quinoa, maybe some cheese on top of that quinoa, and some low sugar fruit as part of, their meal. So on the whole, we try to teach that regardless. If you buy a yogurt, buy a plain yogurt and then sweeten it with pumpkin puree because it doesn't have all the sugar to it, or sweeten it or, flavor it with something like seeds or something else like a whole grain cereal that's high protein or what have you, just to drive down that glycemic load that people are out there consuming because they don't realize how much extra sugar they get just by consuming their everyday foods. And I try to get people to really pay attention to how do you want to spend those grams of sugar.
And when you're talking about, broadly sticking to a low glycemic nutrition plan, I mean, that even extends for you when it comes to race week, right? So even right. Maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of your race week nutrition plan, and even while carbohydrates might be a component of that, you're not suggesting people start slamming white bread and pasta and sugary sports drinks and carb loading in that traditional sense, right?
Right. So what we tend to do as we go into race week is we 3 days out from the marathon shift to what's called a low residue nutrition plan. And that's where we reduce the fiber content in the diet. And most people say, okay, once you do that, don't you then create a high glycemic plan? And the answer is no, you don't have to. Because typically all that fiber is helping create the low glycemic plan. And so what we do is we actually utilize the Generation UCAN at meals and snacks to help us create the increase in carbohydrate that they're taking in without the increase in glycemic load, because otherwise, they're going to go snack on gummy bears and things of that nature, white rice. And so instead at mealtime, we can really focus in on things that are a lot healthier in terms of the food carbohydrates that we're consuming and let our fiber be in that rather than something else. And so it's a great way to help create the low residue nutrition plan and keep it low glycemic and not rely on the high glycemic carbs that they frequently do. Now, do you still eat a bit more of the high glycemic carbs as you taper and use a low residue plan? Yes, absolutely. But we try to keep that to a minimum. And most runners appreciate that just because they also see a little bit of weight gain on the scale as they go into the marathon because they're tapering. Their muscle glycogen stores are increasing. There's more sodium and water in the body. And they say, okay, I put on 3 pounds. How much more am I going to put on before I toe the line? And so it's also a way just to help us, keep body weight in check within a reasonable amount of where they had gotten to with training.
And when you talk about, incorporating UCAN, whether it's the bars or powders as part of this kind of race week, low residue nutrition plan that you described, you're not suggesting at all that people are replacing, meals with UCAN shakes or anything like that, right? In fact, oftentimes they're having the UCAN in conjunction with the meal, perhaps.
Yeah, correct. They're usually having it in conjunction with the meal. It's just a way to keep the meal more high carbohydrate, keep the fiber out of the diet, and also just keep the glycemic load low. You otherwise also can end up really hungry on a low residue plan. And so it's just a strategy we use as a carbohydrate source that isn't going to cause huge shifts in blood glucose and maybe some excessive saturation, I guess you could say, of the glycogen stores. Because I think what people don't realize is that when you're training on a regular basis, and part of this is the psychological component of getting ready to race, is that you're training on a day-to-day basis with not a full set of glycogen stored in the muscle, so in not all of the sodium and water content that it can really hold. And so as they start to taper, they turn around and they kind of go, why am I gaining so much weight on the scale? And it actually tends to concern some athletes. Probably the more recreational athletes get a little more concerned about it, and you try to control that concern. So we'll use the generation UCAN in conjunction with the meal to drive up the carbohydrate source and minimize maybe some of the additional weight gain. I noticed we can keep it down just a little bit more when our carbohydrate source is that low glycemic.
Very interesting. So finally, our final topic for this evening, Krista, it's Boston Marathon Week. The Boston Marathon is coming up this weekend. And as we talked about before, you've had an opportunity to train a lot of the biggest names in US marathoning for Boston, or work with a lot of them while they're training for Boston. Meb, Dathan, Kara. So in terms of Boston and getting an athlete ready for Boston, what's unique about training someone for Boston?
Well, the biggest thing about Boston is just the variations that can come, on race day itself, the weather. We're seeing that, right? So you have to prepare them for that, whether it's their hydration strategy and cooling strategy, or, just how much carbohydrate are they going to need, because it is a rough little course. And it's a course where things start to get rough at a point in the marathon that's usually kind of a make or break for people anyway. It's a point where they might feel good at mile 17, 18 typically in a marathon, and they don't start to crest into that potential, what I call danger zone, where they might actually drop out on the back end until they're at mile 21, maybe 22. And in Boston, that's, mile 17, 18 is when you're going into the hills, right? And people don't realize how effectively, when you run or prepare for Boston, you've got to teach your body to conserve energy from the very start of it. And I think it's just one of those that's just gotten more people than they have ever anticipated. And with the weather changes that can happen for that race, it just, on the whole, is one where you have to teach people to manage their energy and prepare for any type of weather condition. And it's just, I can't tell you how many don't prepare for that.
Yeah, and I know, specifically on the weather, last year, 2018, of course, the weather was wild, rain, windy, some of the craziest weather we've seen in recent years. This year, we're talking about the fact that it may be very similar. So, you know, we spent a lot of time, of course, today on nutrition. When it comes to fueling and you're running in inclement weather, you know, rainy weather, windy weather, where you have to work harder, what specifically should people consider? Maybe not changing all the way, but tweaking slightly when it comes to their fueling strategy.
Well, the colder it is, and when you all of a sudden just experience something that much colder, you're going to increase carbohydrate metabolism. And so one of the things we try to figure out with athletes is what is the maximal amount of carbohydrate I can consume in a race. And I typically say that most athletes have their safe zone, and I would say safe zone is usually for most of my clients about 0.5 gram of carbohydrate per minute. And then they have their upper tolerable limit of carbohydrate intake, which is about 0.8 grams per minute. And so when they go into a race like what they're getting ready to face in Boston on Monday, it's going to be cold. There's going to be more shivering. The muscles are going to need more carbohydrate. And so they're going to have to be able to tolerate that higher limit of carbohydrate in order to probably do well. The other thing that will happen is that fluids will actually pass through the body a little bit differently. You know, Shalane Flanagan's kind of infamous porta potty run last year was a part of that cold weather. Your body vasoconstricts, and then it says, oh, wow, you know, I need to go to the bathroom. So people are more likely to lose fluids in that manner in a race that's really cold. So you actually have to teach them to control their fluids in a cold race so that that doesn't become a chronic issue out on the course, versus in a hot race, they're going to be losing fluids pretty consistently throughout, and, you know, at a far more excessive rate than what you would see in the cold race. So things like that you have to prepare them for to change up on race day.
You know, I have a feeling, Krista, whether people are listening to this year or next year or 3 years from now, that the topic of how to deal with crazy weather or cold weather in Boston is always going to be relevant. It seems to be something that is a topic of conversation every year. Before we wrap this up, I just wanted to ask you personally, what's your fondest memory of Boston? Is there any one or two memories in your experience, either being at the Boston Marathon or working with athletes, that stands out to you in particular?
You know, what was really fun for me in 2011 was that I was living on the Boston course itself. I worked for a military research group there in Natick, Massachusetts, and I was able to actually watch from my front lawn. And Kayak Goucher had just had her son Colt, and we had been working on nutrition pretty heavily as she came back from having her son and was getting ready for the Boston Marathon. And so actually got to be out there on course as she went by. And that was just a little bit more fun, I felt like, than, you know, the typical sit in the room and wait and watch on TV. And so that was really probably one of the best marathons that I had been at, was because I could be out there on course very naturally and see each of the runners that I had worked with over the years who were running the race. So that was a pretty special Boston for me.
Anytime you can just look out your door and watch the Boston Marathon, you're doing pretty well. That sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Well, with
good.
that, just really want to thank you, Krista, bringing a wealth of knowledge to this discussion, and it's really interesting to kind of hear, you know, both your perspective from knowing the science and the research, but then also kind of some of the practical strategies that you've utilized with all different types of athletes. So yeah, really enjoyed the conversation, and we'll definitely have more of these to come with you. Marathoning is one area of expertise, but like we talked about at the very beginning, your areas of expertise are wide ranging. So this is just a sneak peek in what's to come. But thanks so much for your time, Krista. Really enjoyed it, and thanks for all the insight.
Well, thank you, Varun, and look forward to hopefully sharing more as we work further with you.
Sounds great. Well, thanks to everybody for tuning in. I'm Varun Sriram with UCAN. We were joined today by Dr. Krista Austin to talk about marathon fueling. Hope you all enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.